Hello and welcome to Africa at the G20, the podcast where we explore how African voices, priorities, and leadership can shape global governance spaces. I'm your host, Raisa Cole, Climate Governance Lead at Democracy Works Foundation. In today's episode, we turn our focus to the Foundation's 20 recommendations, a set of proposals designed to strengthen the role of philanthropy, civil society, and governments in shaping a just, inclusive, and sustainable global economy. With South Africa's 2025 G20 presidency, it's more important than ever to ensure African perspectives are not only heard, but actively integrated into global policy agendas. So it's wonderful to just have a kind of quiet moment together to speak about the kind of G20 processes and how they've been evolving in South Africa, but also this kind of moment for the G20 in Africa with the African Union's kind of recent permanent membership and our South African presidency's focus on the kind of G20 Africa or what the G20 means for Africa.
Yes, no, thank you. It's great to be here. And as you say, it's quite an important moment for South Africa as a country and Africa as a continent in terms of us hosting the G20 this year, and particularly given the geopolitical context that under which this presidency is taking place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for a lot of us, it's also kind of building the plane as it's flying, trying to kind of figure out, the material relevance of the G20 and its kind of applicability to the work that we're doing on the everyday kind of one thing that we have been kind of struggling with, not so much struggling, but really kind of challenged with is to create the relevance of the G20 kind of moment for South Africa and Africa to grassroots organizations and CSOs, and to really kind of draw those links between their kind of material realities and what the G20 means in terms of this kind of almost abstract policy space. So yeah, I guess within that G20 kind of context, Foundations 20, as you know, you've worked with F20 before, released our recommendations in February. And this conversation is really to kind of unpack and think through what those F20 recommendations mean for Africa, for South Africa and Africa in general. And maybe you can start off with telling us a little bit about your relationship with F20 and how that's kind of evolved over time.
And so from last year, when the F20 set up a sustainable finance advisory group, ZeniZeni was invited to join that group. And that we did that very happily, because increasingly in the way the world, call it, is structured, philanthropy is playing a really important role in guiding and informing and creating collaborations that advance some of the issues that ZeniZeni Sustainable Finance also looks at. And your comment about the challenges in making sure that or finding ways to demonstrate the relevance of the G20 to ordinary people, South Africans, other Africans on the continent, residents, citizens, etc., is critical, because the likes of the F20, very important philanthropic organizations, but also the G20 countries shape the narratives about what's happening and help us to make sense in some ways of what's important to focus on. And this is at an individual level, family level, community, country, even a global level. And this is largely because the G20 is so influential from an economic and political perspective. The countries that chose to come together to form the G20 did that in part because of their influence, and they recognize that they have an influence. And so I think as a first impact is really around the narrative of what's important, what needs to be focused on. And that then not trickles down, that's the wrong word. It then influences what happens in each individual G20 country or region, because the African Union and the EU are also part of the G20. So that's been our involvement so far as ZeniZeni through with the F20. And the recent release of your recommendations was very welcome. I think you did it much earlier than many other groups. I was very impressed when I saw it cross my desk or arrive in my email inbox, actually, that the F20 had already come up with some recommendations for the G20. Yeah, so very excited to speak about those.
Wonderful. I mean, yeah, and obviously the recommendations do have kind of a key role to play in shaping that narrative, like you were saying. And actually, one of the motivators for kind of releasing it so early was to facilitate a kind of continuity, obviously, from the previous G20 presidencies that were obviously had a strong kind of global south focus. And so to kind of also give us the time to kind of critically engage with the recommendations, in a way, kind of putting it out there so people can start the discussion. And what it gave us the opportunity to do was to then really, sorry, what it gave us the opportunity to do was to then really, yeah, critically engage with it in terms of what it means, what these recommendations mean from an African perspective, and within African contexts. And I think today, obviously, given your expertise and the work of ZeniZeni, we really want to talk about recommendation 4, which, as you know, is to strategically align and mobilize flexible financial resources with climate goals and sustainable development. And so, yeah, maybe just to start off our discussion, it would be really kind of great to hear your thoughts around why this alignment and mobilization of flexible climate finance is particularly urgent for African countries, at this stage of climate and development planning.
Yes, it's finance, I often say, is not everything. It can't solve all problems, but it brings when it's on the table, it brings the right people to that table. Because it's the language of our modern economy. How do we implement something? Finance will always be a part of that, in addition to other things like human resource and technology and other things. But finance is central to that. And so in the context of climate, it's even more central in the sense that because of the way climate impacts have evolved over the last century, we know that Africa in particular, many African countries are highly vulnerable to climate and do not have the ability to be able to adapt in time and at the right pace to the climate impacts that are already there, never mind the climate impacts that are coming. So our responses to climate change have to involve financing of things to allow us to adapt, which is critical, and also to respond and recover from the losses and damages that climate is already inflicting, whether that's sort of slow onset droughts or floods. I mean, it particularly happens through weather, but also the other consequences that come from that, such as political instability, social strife, and changing economies, because we know that in the economy of the future, a low carbon, climate resilient, inclusive future, some of the technologies and companies, therefore, that exist will no longer need to exist, particularly around the fossil fuel value chain, for example. So there are huge shifts that we need to make in Africa to respond to climate, and finance is central to that. So, of course, we have several different agreements at a global level to try to address this, the key one being the Paris Agreement. And over the years, the Paris Agreement has been in place since 2015, but even under the UN Convention on Climate Change, there have been mechanisms for richer countries who've caused climate change to support and take account of the impacts of climate in other countries, and this includes African countries. And there have been funds set up, such as the Green Climate Fund and others, Adaptation Fund, etc., under these agreements to help facilitate the disbursement of that funding. But we know that as much as there's finance, if there is finance available, accessing that finance is critical. So, say in a particular country, how would a smallholder farmer that's experiencing drought, how would that smallholder farmer get access to that finance? Those are really important questions, and it's been the track record has not been great in terms of access. That's one thing. But another thing about finance is that it goes to where it gets the highest returns. I like to say finance goes where it's wanted, but where it's wanted does not necessarily align with what's needed to address climate. So we still have financing going to things that are not good for the climate. I've mentioned fossil fuels already, but even things like the way we design our cities, for example, where we pave a lot of things that will cover them, paved roads, pavements, etc., which makes floods much more likely to happen, for example, which is not good, given the high weather impacts from climate change, storms, etc. So we also need to shift finance away from the things that do not support our ability to address climate. So there's a lot there, shifting finance, and also the finance that is available, making that accessible. That is really key. And then the third part is just making sure that there is enough, so call it the quantum, the amount of finance available needs to be enough. So that there are a lot of moving parts, but all of it is about making finance more accessible in the right amount and going to the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think you gave a very good kind of breakdown of the climate finance value chain and kind of ecosystem in general. And yeah, definitely these reforms need to happen in order for that climate finance to reach the kind of communities, frontline communities that are most effective. And a lot of the discussions, obviously, around the G20 has been around kind of the subnationalization or localization of climate finance. But what would you say are some of those barriers then that are stopping kind of climate finance reaching communities that are most affected across the continent?
I think there's several barriers, some of them which are unique to climate, but some of them are common across all types of financing. And I think it's important to remember that as well. So, in other words, there's some systemic factors that need to be addressed, so at a system level of the whole way that we set up our financing sector. But starting specifically with some of the barriers for climate itself is sometimes our governments don't understand or don't know exactly what is needed at a particular point in time. So if they're taking a top-down view of what's needed, without having engaging and clearly identifying, call them the beneficiaries or potential beneficiaries of climate finance, the two sides don't meet. So where governments are not able to do this, sometimes for no fault of their own, there's some countries where there's fragile situations, whether it's war or extreme, natural disasters, for example. But sometimes it's also because the governments are not willing to even engage necessarily with all parts of their populations to figure out, well, what is actually needed. So call that a bottom-up, very much locally led approach to say, well, this is what we need because to respond to climate change. So that's one of the big barriers, is that information. And then even where that information is in place, so there's an understanding that, for example, a seawall needs to be put up, or we need to shift where the way we're growing our food in a particular way or a particular area, for example. So even where there's that understanding, both at a government level, which is I'm saying this top level, and the I'm saying bottom up understanding, even then it's a question of, well, what needs prioritizing, what needs to be done, because as much as you could have, call it a long list of what needs to be done, but there's limited capacity to address everything at once. So I think we also need to be really clear about ways and processes to make sure we prioritize to really get to the important issues as quickly as possible. Not forgetting the other issues, but making sure that the most important issues are addressed first. And then another barrier is then, once those things have been identified, that potentially the finance then flows. But the key barrier is then to say, well, how do you make sure that it goes to where it's supposed to go? And that's often a process of a government. If the money is flowing through the government, the public financial management system needs to be really up to of a very high standard to ensure that the money goes to where it goes to. And if there are challenges along the way, that those are identified. But it's also, some finance goes through the private sector. I think that's a very important part of the discussion here, and particularly in the G20 context. And G is about governments, but even within the G20, there's a strong recognition of the role of the private sector, because it's part of most economies to varying degrees across the continent. So how do you make sure that the private sector is on the same page as government, and that they're held accountable, and also have the same goals with whichever financing they provide? I think that's also a key factor to all of this. So there are lots of barriers. I could go on with a very long list, but those are some of the ones which are unique to climate finance, and the broader financial system as well, as I said, like public financial management. And some of the key issues are about the international flows of finance. And these are the challenges there, or the barriers are often systemic. And it's partly because maybe this is human nature, I'm not sure. Love your views on this. But often it's easier the providers of finance think it's easier to do things at scale, which is sometimes good, but and part of that's to say, well, if we give a big amount of money to one or two, say, organizations or initiatives or programs related to climate, we tick a big box and it's done. But often in that scale, you lose the nuances of what's needed on a very particular, almost tailored level to address certain climate issues. So I'd mentioned farming. So farming, say, a farmer in Mali would have a very, very different needs to a farmer in, say, Tanzania. But the funding might all be lumped together and be expected to somehow be applicable, the terms of that funding, to the farmer in Tanzania and Mali, and yet they're very different situations. So I think that's one of the big challenges as well.
Absolutely. I think what you were saying about kind of, the climate financing system being reflective of kind of the broader financing system really hit home for me. One of my biggest kind of advocacy points throughout this G20 process is that kind of climate governance or climate financing doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's kind of completely reflective of the existing kind of governance structures or the existing financing structures. And so it's always going to reflect that. And almost this climate moment means that we can kind of have a radical transformation of the climate finance space, and that has very real lessons for the broader finance space. And maybe climate is our kind of moment to have a almost proof of concept that is possible, and that kind of transformation is possible within broader governance and broader finance structures. Yeah, so thank you so much for that. I think the other thing that really hit home for me was this, I suppose, like our definitions of risk and how we kind of frame risk and opportunity. And that almost brings me into the fossil fuel sector that you kept referencing, because the fact is that finance is still flowing to the fossil fuel industry, and that is obviously based on kind of a track record of return, like you were saying. Finance flows where it's wanted, and not necessarily where it's needed, and that is obviously informed by our perception of risk and return. And so maybe a segue then into the kind of recommendation on fossil fuel subsidy reform. Could you speak a bit about, what a complete phase out would look like within an African context? And especially in those countries that are reliant on fossil fuels for energy access, and public revenue. And obviously, within an African context where we have kind of, high levels of energy poverty, how do we balance all of that? How do we make sure that we ensure a continued effort towards addressing energy poverty while kind of phasing out fossil fuel subsidies?
That's like the almost, I don't want to say $1 million question. Now I think it's almost $1 trillion. People talk in trillions nowadays.
Absolutely.
But yes, I mean, we know that fossil fuels need to be significantly reduced. I stand to be corrected, but it's amounts of up to 80-90% less use of fossil fuels in order to keep global temperature warming within reasonable amounts that humans can survive. So the 1.5 degree average warming across the globe. And there are many ways to do that. And this is the energy sector. So the first way is to find substitutes for fossil fuel energy. And largely in most industries which use fossil fuels, there are substitutes available, renewable energy, which does not have the same impact on climate. So that is the first and foremost thing that we need to focus on. But at the same time, as you mentioned, and the F20 recommendations say, well, what's stopping that shift to renewable energy, especially now that many renewable energy technologies are actually cheaper to install, and to run and provide, call it an economic cost benefit that is far superior to fossil fuels, even especially when you take into account the non-climate aspects, impacts of fossil fuels, such as the impact on air quality, destruction of biodiversity loss, etc. So these fossil fuel subsidies is a key way that historically governments have promoted the industry, and understandably so. I don't think there was some negative Machiavellian plan to say we're going to promote something that is really negative. At the time, I think about maybe 150 years ago, that fossil fuels were the game changer in terms of energy. And so countries that had it exploited it, and it's become an integral part of energy, of the global energy system. But now we know that the damages it does, we need to phase it out. Those subsidies in particular that governments provided to promote these industries over the decades need to be addressed and removed because they provide that incentive to continue using fossil fuels. When, as I said, we need to move to renewable energy sources. So that's been identified already by as mentioned in the F20 recommendations, that the G20 had already committed to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. However, we also discussed that fossil fuels need to go much beyond inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. To reduce fossil fuels by about 80% or more, all subsidies need to go. And it is a balance, as you said, because in countries where the subsidies have been in place for a long time, they were there for a reason and it affected the price. So removing those subsidies would increase the price, particularly to local populations, local consumers, as well as, of course, people who import those fossil fuels as well. So that needs to be taken into account. In the countries that have removed subsidies, and say most recently in Nigeria, for example, and that was not for climate reasons, it was largely to balance their budget because they couldn't continue to afford to provide those subsidies. It caused significant economic strife and hardship on people, and there were protests as well around that because of the increase in fuel prices that came in as a result. So this needs to be done. The fossil fuel subsidies need to be removed, but in a just way. So the impacts on the most vulnerable and people who cannot respond, and businesses as well, because they're also vulnerable businesses, particularly small, medium, and micro enterprises, that those impacts need to be lessened. So it has to be done in a gradual way in many countries, but it's essential. And I think, like most things, you need to start with a plan of some sort and then begin to implement that plan. So the G20 needs to come up with some sort of plan to phase out fossil fuel subsidies as recommended in the F20 paper, because without that, we will not address climate change. And more importantly, the funding or the money that governments use to provide those subsidies can be redirected towards other development issues to address things like education, health, wherever there's a so-called hole in government budget. So, in other words, it's not a losing game, as may be portrayed sometimes by the fossil fuel industry. There's significant benefits, renewable energy, of course, being one, and the ability to transform our energy systems. I think you'd mentioned something earlier about the need to have significant transformation in addressing development, but particularly climate challenges. And shifting to a new energy system away from fossil fuels allows that to happen. We can transform and restructure our entire energy system in that process. And that would be a positive thing in terms of energy access, as you mentioned, which many Africans don't have at the moment. And in terms of energy access, in particular, electricity access, because electricity is safe, it's reliable, and can be a game changer in people's lives. And everyone should have the right to that in the 21st century. So there are a lot of positives as well from removing fossil fuel subsidies, but as I say, it needs to be done in a considered way to make sure that the unintended negative consequences are minimized or removed entirely.
Great. I think, yeah, what you were saying about this kind of transformation being possible, I think obviously philanthropy has a big role to play in some of that kind of de-risking or risks sharing or track record development or pipeline development, so that the kind of climate financing can flow to the communities that are most affected. And I was wondering whether you could share any kind of examples across the continent or in the work of ZeniZeni in how either philanthropy or the private sector has supported this kind of risk sharing mechanisms, or has been kind of active in de-risking climate investments?
You put me on the spot there. I'm just thinking, I know of so many examples, but one doesn't come to mind straight away. But in principle, the philanthropy plays a role in de-risking, but even in the planning part. So some of these new ideas, new ways of financing and structures, they don't fall within government officials or DFI's sort of day jobs. So I think philanthropy plays a really important role in providing the time and space for these ideas to just come to light in the first place. So that sort of planning phase or blue sky thinking phase. So I think philanthropy plays a really good role in providing essentially grant funding to allow people to come out of their day jobs and think about some of these problems in a very deep way to come up with solutions. But to answer your question more directly about the de-risking, yes, again, going back to the finance goes where it's wanted, and what you mentioned about risk return is where there are very high risks, there's an expectation of a higher return. But if the risks are too high, finance won't even go there at all. And this risk can be, it's seen on the part of the person providing the funding or the institution providing the funding. So it's their perceived sense of risk. So some of it is real risk, fundamental risk is often referred to in finance speak terms, but some of it is perceived risk. And so philanthropy can play an important role in reducing both the perceived risk and the real risk that's on the ground. So, for example, in some countries, there's a real risk related to foreign exchange. So if you're funding a project in a particular currency, say it's euros, into a country that doesn't itself generate a lot of euros, when that country is trying to repay the funding in euros, there's what's called a foreign exchange risk and a foreign currency risk. If that country cannot buy euros at the time that they need to repay the financing, then it's a big problem. So the philanthropy can play a role in that sense in creating vehicles to guarantee financial instruments that cover that type of foreign exchange risk. There are instruments in the market, financial instruments in the market, which allow, say, a government to, if they bought that instrument, if there was a foreign exchange crisis, they can draw on that, and it's almost a guarantee that they have the foreign exchange available to repay that funding. And so philanthropy, because it's providing money that is not expected to be returned necessarily to them, they're not expecting to be repaid. That money then is really suitable to covering those sorts of risks. And I'm trying to think of a tangible example. Why is one not coming to mind? Maybe you can prompt me to give an example, and then I can speak to it in more detail. But yeah, in principle, I think that's where philanthropy or philanthropic funding. Sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful. The philanthropic part, I think, can play a really important role. And then once those risks are covered, that's when particularly private finance can then come in and say, okay, you've covered that risk that was too high for me, so now I'm willing to fund the project in the country. For example, building out renewable energy infrastructure that is resilient to climate change, for example. So it can really be a game changer, let's say, both in the planning phase, coming up with new structures and ideas, and then also call it the implementation phase of taking on particular risks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, apart from the kind of hard, cold numbers and kind of complex financial modeling around how we measure risk, I think a role of philanthropy is also around almost changing perceptions and doing a lot of kind of advocacy work around how risk is measured and understood and the kind of indicators and metrics we have to do so. And it reminds me of the kind of it's quite an old case study now, but the Nigerian uniform underwriting standards for housing finance within the informal sector was such a game changer, I think, for the continent, because it really demonstrated that, the way we sort of understand informality and risk can be totally turned on its head if you have kind of African thinkers from the continent to intimately kind of understand that how that risk kind of shows up in the world, or how it kind of like what's the kind of hardcore numbers linked to risk from almost a social cultural perspective. And I think, yeah, so a lot of I think the perceptions around this are informed by the global north. And so one thing that we really trying to do as Democracy Works Foundation is to also look at how we kind of perceive climate change in general, and then climate risk in particular, and what that means for kind of financing value chains.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really important area. I would argue, though, that some of it is, you mentioned the global north for climate, but I think it partly goes back to human nature as well. I've mentioned that earlier about wanting to, to find a simpler way of achieving scale and going for big programs as opposed to the smaller ones. But in the context of the risk and perception, I think there's a lot we can learn from other areas of financing. For example, small and medium enterprises. Also, in every country, irrespective of wealth, small and medium enterprises are seen as high risk. For example, from a financing perspective, women as well in the gender context. Women are also seen as being higher risk than men, ironically. So we seem as humans to have, and therefore the organizations in which we sit, to have these biases, cognitive biases related, particularly when it comes to financing and perceptions of risk.
So just to end off our conversation, and thank you so much for making the time to talk to us and to share your thoughts. Yeah, it would be really good to kind of get some closing statements around what African leadership should be prioritizing within this kind of Africa G20 moment.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been a really interesting conversation. And at the first part of the conversation, we spoke about the challenging geopolitical circumstances that this G20 presidency finds itself in. So I think needs to inform what African leaders prioritize. I think in the one important thing, even from last year leading up to this, is that we need to build the capacity to develop common positions that we bring into the G20 context, and those positions also need to be implemented in our own countries. So governments need to give credibility to any AU positions that come into the G20 by making sure that they're reflected in their own local policies as well. And then a second, I think, important priority is to build bridges on issues where consensus is possible. I mean, the G20 is self-appointed and it's consensus-based, and given the current environment, finding consensus is proving to be very difficult. But there are always a few areas where consensus can be built, and I think it's important to recognize and identify those and build on those. And then to find other spaces outside of the G20, actually, to address the others where consensus cannot be found, because that's the reality that we're in at the moment. So from a narrative perspective, I think it's really important to ensure the continued success of the G20 and to point to pluralism. I mean, G20 is not fully multilateralism, it's almost there, but not quite. that it's important to have these spaces where global issues can be addressed because of the narratives that are framed by these discussions, and then those narratives feed into real actions on the ground. So where consensus isn't possible, I think it's important for African leaders to find other spaces where those conversations can take place that meet the priorities of the continent. And this perhaps leads to something the governor of the central bank, South African central bank, Lesetja Kanyabo, recently in a speech made in the US, suggested that the G20 agenda needed to be simplified and it was too complex, and that the G20 tends to be more effective in responding to crisis situations. I don't fully agree with that, but I do think it's an important moment, given the geopolitical dynamics, to reassess what should be on the G20's agenda, because ultimately it doesn't help if more divisions are created rather than consensus around key issues, global issues. So I think that's something for African leaders to consider. And finally, I think to push for transparency. The African leaders should push in general for transparency in the G20. I think the Sustainable Finance Working Group, which sits under the finance track of the G20, is relatively transparent in the sense that they produce a roadmap. I think it's a 5-year roadmap, and they produce reports and progress of certain countries in terms of tracking progress against that. I think that should be the case across all G20 working groups. So yes, I think that's what I would recommend African leaders prioritize.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Malango. I really appreciate the time that you've taken to speak to us, and for sharing your very valuable insights. This will obviously be used to kind of inform the F20 advocacy activities throughout the year, and to have more discussions in the course of this year.
Thanks so much. This has been a really interesting conversation, very thought-provoking for me as well. And
wonderful. Thank you so much. Bye.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
The Foundations 20 platform is a network of more than 80 foundations and philanthropic organizations from different parts of the world. Considering the G20 countries as a key player to deliver on the global climate goals and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, F20 calls for joint transnational action towards sustainable development and for future-proof pathways towards solutions of today's most pressing challenges: the climate and biodiversity crises and a renewable energy-based just transition.